Let me start with a thank you to the team at Dods D&I. If you're following them on Twitter, you can do. It's at Dods Diversity. I'll put that out there nice and early. I want to carry on with some thank yous really as we kick off this morning. Race to Equality. That's a hashtag, by the way, hashtag Race to Equality. My name's Rob Neil, and my job today is a very straightforward and a very easy one. I've got a few opening comments in a moment after we complete these electronic or virtual world domestics that Grace has kicked us off on. But ahead of that, and after my opening comments, we've got a series of speakers that are going to share from their own experiences, from their own knowledge, their own insights, covering a range of topics that you've no doubt familiarized yourselves with from the program for the day. I'll introduce those in turn. We've got some breaks already scheduled because we know it's important to get our eyes and faces out of the screen in this 2D existence we find ourselves, paying attention to our health. And then we've got later on in the afternoon, after a lunch break, we've got something by way of a panel discussion for you, featuring those in other industries around this work that we do to deliver on race equality. More of that detail as we step through. Let me complete the thank you by saying thank you to each of you. I'm not sure, Grace, how many have we got online at the moment? Do we know?
Yes, we have 36 with us today, not including panelists, 37. 37.
See, it's going up all the time. 37 have arrived literally on time for this 9 o'clock kickoff. I'm going to share some opening remarks, but I want to say thank you to all of you for being here today. I know how busy it is, how we do need to set aside time for our development. And here we are, Race to Equality. Another opportunity for us to hear from others, to pick up some hints and tips and I guess best practice, but to hear from some of those challenging and exciting opportunities that there are for us to progress in the workplace, us, Black, Asian, minority ethnic people, but looking at delivering on race equality, delivering greater equity in the workplace. And what a year it's been. What a year it's been here 2020. How many of us can think back to those days when we would set off in the morning typically, but off and into a different physical space for our work and to offer our working effort. Here we are now staring at the end of year, staring at Christmas and what that might bring for us. And we know already that that's going to be a very different festive period. Each day, it seems, announcements by the government of the day about this second period of lockdown and whether we can and will ease out of it this calendar year. Lots of question marks being asked. But if we rewind the clock, what, 8-9 months, we know that it was at the end of March, going into the weekend, the final weekend of March, we discovered that there was something of a pandemic upon us, something that we would need to respond to. And so it was on Monday, the 23rd of March, the first lockdown was announced. And for some of us, a very novel experience, almost a hint of excitement about what that would mean for us in our working effort. We'd get to stay at home a bit longer, some of us were saying or heard to say. Are we online? Can we do our work? Very early on, there were some questions about whether we would be as productive working from home. Would we get used to it? Will the equipment be up to it? How will we communicate beyond the mobile phone? And yet, here we are in an example of this 2D existence via Zoom. But MS Teams has started playing its role in full, and how we can increase that dynamic. And some of us will be familiar with other platforms, WebEx, Go, Meet Me, and others that we know offer that kind of versatility and dexterity in how we communicate. And so we offer this event in a virtual space. You know, Dods could not have imagined that that would be a requirement, and yet they've moved swiftly and with real agile pace to provide this opportunity. And 37 of you have arrived here today. But I want to take the opportunity before introducing our first speaker. I want to talk about some of those particular and specific points that relate to the experience of Black, Asian, minority ethnic people. A lot of the work I do is with representative voices of the BAME, the Black, Asian and minority ethnic community, whether through staff networks, employee resource groups, initiatives targeting the development of Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff. This is part of, I guess, my working effort, and had been long before the start of this year. So there's something of a comment that I'm here to offer around the situation we now find ourselves in. It was in the May of this year, May the 25th, that George Floyd, bless his soul, lost his life. George Floyd was taken from his family by and following an incident with a police officer who had apprehended him. It was in real time. It was in front of our very eyes. It was recorded live. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we saw a human life taken, as if he were an animal, as if he was something less than human. Indelibly marked, many of us are. And for those who could watch it through, we are still wrestling with those scenes. What does it mean for us around the world who can look at that and feel something in an even deeper way than some of our friends and colleagues in the workplace who perhaps don't share that same cultural background? But making sense of it, perhaps feeling spiritually the neck of pain and ache, the knee down in our own necks. What then do we do to respond to that? Many an exercise in many organizations about listening more intently to the voice of Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff. But not just listening, hearing what's being said, that for so many years, decades, an oppression and a form of oppression has been evident in the workplace. So off the back of the pandemic, COVID-19, we have this additional feature of our existence. Black Lives Matter has come to the fore to amplify the voice of Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff here in the UK. And we know, because of the lockdown, that we are all forced, some of us compelled, to take in the news. There was a program just last night on Channel 4 posing the provocative question, is COVID-19 racist? And so with real evidence, empirical evidence, the program looked at whether or not this virus that impacts on us all could be deemed racist. Now, very early on in the program, I don't know how many of you caught it, it's very clear that it's not a racist virus. Viruses are no respecter of ethnicity or even national borders. Our own Prime Minister was at death's door not that long ago. And yet we know, again through research and empirical evidence, that the same virus does impact on Black, Asian and minority ethnic people disproportionately. There are disparities born out of living conditions, born out of pre-existing conditions. And so this is a factor. This is a factor. When you work and go into workplaces and look at the proximity to the contagion, the essential workers and their proximity to where that virus can be picked up, we know that there is a greater chance of that impacting on Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. The evidence is now clear. And so bringing it back into our respective workplaces, what then do we do? How do we respond to all of that? this perfect storm that is now upon us, this opportunity for us to create a new normal, this opportunity that presents each and every one of us to do the right thing, to listen and hear what's being said by those groups that have been marginalized, that have been traditionally pushed to the edges. How then can we co-create a more equitable future, a future that takes real account, deep and meaningful account of our differences, and not simply treat everybody the same because we are not, but encourages and promotes the differences that we all enjoy, and in an exciting way creates a future that takes account of those enriching differences. The race to equality, the race to be equitable in the workplace. Consider the evolution of the equalities legislation. Take yourselves back to the 60s and early 70s, when that same equality legislation talked about what could be done. That was the mantra, what could be done. It was an imaginative look at what was possible. Forward a decade to the late 70s and the early 80s, and that injunction through legislation talked about what should be done. It was no longer a light touch, what could be done. We were no longer dipping our toe into equitable treatment. We were now saying, let us swim into it and realize and acknowledge what should be done. It was a firmer injunction. And forward another 10 years, and what we recognize through the Equality Act 2010, now of course a decade old, and some would argue in need of some revisiting and refreshing, but in 2010, what that gave us in bringing all equalities legislation together, enshrined in a single act, the Equality Act 2010, is what we must have due regard to. 9 protected characteristics with the prospect of provision for social mobility as well, but we know we've moved from what could be done to what should be done to what we must have due regard to. So you see, the legislation is catching up with what we now know to be the lived existence. And yet we operate in a time where just this year, we have heard powerful voices in positions of power, talking about the legalities of what we teach our children in school, what we speak of when we talk about things such as critical race theory, the very root of many of our considerations as to what the law needs to be saying to us, about what the practices need to include, the procedures. So I seek to encourage you as we talk about this perfect storm, listen intently to what's being said by those in positions of power. Challenge if you must, but listen and understand what's being said about the language that we can use, the language that we can use to deliver on equality and to create a more equitable workplace. We can no longer afford to ignore the impact of discrimination. Racism hurts everyone. Racism impacts on everyone. It's in all our interests to tackle systemic racism, in all our interests. We need to look deeper to discover whether our actions and decisions mean that we condone or condemn racial inequality. What is it we are really doing to deliver on this shared objective that many of us speak about? What are we really doing to run that race to equality? How can we get under the skin of bias and really understand its genesis, where it comes from, why it persists, in the way it does, or at least the evidence suggests that it persists. We need greater transparency. It's transparency that will lead to better decisions on representation, on attraction of talent, better results in our policies and our services. A shift in our mindset is what's called for. It's what's now required to create a new normal, a new way of working, which by instinct will be more inclusive. The aspiration is for us to be more inclusive by instinct. And for that, we will need to be honest. We will need to create safe places, places where we can say how we feel, where we are no longer penalized for expressing how we experience work. An adult relationship, not one that is about a parent and a child forced through hierarchy, that we can speak on a level as human beings as to what we truly experience. And when we create those safe spaces, we know that that will generate as a reward an openness to have those honest conversations. We're that good. We can do this. Because when that openness is received as a reward for the safe space, what follows is the tree of trust. The trust that then begins to blossom in the workplace. People beginning to trust one another, to operate with a forgiving heart. We will get some of this wrong. Who amongst us is perfect? I would argue none. We will get some of this wrong. But with a heart that says we are committed to more equity in the workplace, we will work at that together. Because out of that trust, we will exercise healthy challenge to the way in which work is delivered. And that healthy challenge is what will provide the culture change. So safe spaces will give us the reward of openness. Openness will bake into our way of working a trust, a level of trust that invites those healthy challenges, because we are all then collectively committed to delivering a more equitable workplace. You see, ultimately, diversity is about the workforce. It is about the differences in a workforce, the differences that we all carry with us as human beings, uniquely different as individuals, and in our own ways, collectively, we can represent a range of diverse differences. So if diversity is about the workforce, inclusion and getting that mix right is about the workplace. It's about the environment. It's about how it feels around here. It's about the ability that we all have to ask, how was your weekend? And to hear how that weekend went. That is inclusion. You see, ultimately, diversity is a fact. It's the scores on the doors. It's the digits, the widgets. It's the data that represents. And some organizations do that well. Some organizations do the measuring well. Some not so well. And some definitely have some room for improvement. But diversity is a fact. It's there. Some try to hide it. Some misrepresent it. But diversity is a fact. Inclusion is a choice. How well we listen to each other, how well we provide for our differences, how well we treat each other is a choice. How we respond when there is evidence of bullying and harassment is a choice. Oh, there may be some policies that talk about how it needs to work, but ultimately it's a choice. And just as it's a choice about how we treat our most vulnerable, how we treat our elderly, how we treat those that have made poor choices and ended up in prison. A measure of a truly democratic society and an equitable one is how well we treat the vulnerable and the less off. And we can do better at that in our places of work. We all can. And if charity really does start at home, we need to get our own organizations in order to be more welcoming of difference in those that we serve. So remember that as we step through the day. Remember that as we invite our speakers to share. Diversity is a fact. Inclusion is a choice. As we step through the day, remember you can catch Dods D&I on Twitter. It's at Dods Diversity, DODS Diversity. And you may wish to add the hashtag too if you are in the habit of tweeting. It's hashtag Race to Diversity. You know, as I round up these opening remarks, just a reminder that this is a wonderful moment in time as we journey. It's an opportunity for us to do the right things, to network and combine and collaborate with others, to co-create a new normal, a new way of working that will see us on a journey, a path to cultural change that will deliver a more equitable workforce. Inclusion is about the workforce, and our race to equality is going to be determined by our ability and our capability of combining to understand more of each other and those differences and deliver a more equitable service for all the people that we serve.